This week on The Review, refugee versus migrant. We talked to Al Jazeera's director of news about the channel's editorial decision to scrap the term migrant in its coverage of the refugee crisis in Europe. And we hear what our field correspondents have to say about this change in terminology and how it affects their reporting on the ground. Hello and welcome to The Review, the show that goes behind the scenes at Al Jazeera and lets you, the viewer, do the talking. A major editorial decision was made at the channel last week, following substantive internal discussions between staff at multiple levels of responsibility. As of now, Al Jazeera no longer uses the term migrant in its coverage of the ongoing refugee crisis unfolding in the Mediterranean and across Europe. Instead, the channel will use the word refugee to describe those leaving their home countries and reaching the continent. News of the editorial shift quickly spread across global media and sparked international discussion about the importance of appropriate language and terminology in journalism. We, at The Review, wanted to understand the very impetus behind the decision now, so we sat down with Salah Negm, Al Jazeera English's director of news, to ask what the reason was for the change in editorial policy and how usage of the word refugee now affects the channel's news output.
We actually used the term migrant, but at a certain day, a few days ago, someone raised the question, are they migrants? Can that be a label for this huge number of people coming to Europe? Are they all seeking permanent residence there? Is that their choice? And aren't they refugees? So the big question in the editorial meeting was, are they refugees and among them migrants, or they are all migrants and among them refugees? And actually we went to UN statistics, which shows that the majority of the people who are arriving on the shores of Europe are refugees fleeing war, persecution, and actually running for their lives. Now, when you change that term, it has also a legal definition, a definition in international law, duties and rights. And when you start dissecting a problem, so you have actually two problems, not only one of migration and one of people who seek refuge in Europe. Then you can have reception centers, documentation, due care. If you need international help, you can do that. It's a service to people. So we thought it's more proper to say refugees. And when it's appropriate to talk about migrants among them, we'll do that. One more thing. There are refugees in Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and there are about 4 million from Syria. A person with that condition who is considered and named by us refugee in Turkey, how come that we call the same person who go to Europe under the same circumstances and conditions a migrant? So he's a refugee in Turkey and migrant in Europe? Doesn't make sense. We are not banning a word or allowing another. It's in fact trying to use the correct word in the correct context.
We also asked our correspondents in the field how the shift to the word refugee affects their coverage of the story on the ground.
A large crowd of people here.
Jonah and Charles Stratford, who have been in the thick of it all, reporting on refugees in France, Greece, and at the Macedonia border, weighed in on the change.
Well, I haven't asked these people, of course, what they prefer to be called. I think given all they've been through, that is unnecessarily obtrusive. But the point about this terminology, of course, is the audience and the audience's understanding of the wider context of this vast movement of people. And in that sense, the word refugee well beats the word migrant. It refers, of course, more properly to people fleeing war, persecution or natural disaster in their countries. Well, the vast majority of these people here, of course, are Syrian refugees, and they're doing just that, fleeing civil war. In amongst their numbers, there are others from a number of other countries. They're economic migrants looking for work, looking for opportunity, but they are the minority. And overall, the word migrant just does not adequately describe this. It suggests a voluntary, opportunistic movement of people looking for better work conditions, a better life. That's not what this is.
Certainly with respect to my experience reporting the so-called migrant crisis in Calais, it became very evident, very clear, very quickly that the 3,000 or so people in that camp, the vast majority of them were not migrants at all. they were refugees. They were fleeing countries where they were suffering persecution, violence, conflict. You know, they were not going or wanting to go to Britain for the sake of just getting a job because there's better economic conditions in Britain. It was literally a case of, we cannot go back to our countries, and we want a safe haven. We want protection from the violence that we're suffering back home. It was also, I must say, a fairly unpleasant experience being part of what can only really be described as almost a media frenzy there in that camp in Calais. It was disturbing to see how some journalists were behaving, and of course this seemed to be stimulated by comments that the British Prime Minister had made with respect to what he described as a swarm of migrants threatening Britain. There were a number of journalists there from the tabloid press. I think there was even one British daily newspaper that ran a line, something along the lines of, well, Britain managed to keep Hitler at bay, surely it can keep a group of migrants at bay too. So it becomes evident just how difficult this word is, migrant, and how it plays into a loaded agenda, if you like, of politicians, of political leaders. I think it's fundamentally important that we really reassess the use of this word, and certainly with respect to reporting the migrant crisis, or the so-called migrant crisis in Calais, those 3,000 people in that camp wanting political asylum. They're not migrants, they're frankly refugees.
Al Jazeera viewers had plenty to say about the editorial shift as well, and social media was abuzz with comments. Vittoria Bertola tweeted, "If you labeled everyone as refugees, you would be mislabeling people in a vast majority of the situation. Would that really be an honest behavior by the media?" Benson and Abossi wrote on Facebook, "We've really reduced the casualties in the Mediterranean to mere numbers. The time to change this is now." Wendy Corton sent in the following message via our Your View portal. Al Jazeera's editorial decision to stop using the word migrant altogether forced me and my family to question how we have been referring to those landing on Europe's shores. We now only refer to them as refugees. Al Jazeera's online editor, Barry Malone, wrote a blog post about why Al Jazeera will not say Mediterranean migrants. It was cited and shared extensively across the web. And in response, Geneva Lunch tweeted, "A thoughtful decision, a thoughtful editorial on why Al Jazeera will not say Mediterranean migrants." We hope you continue to reflect on Al Jazeera's coverage around the world and share your thoughts with us on our website or via Facebook and Twitter. We sign off with a look back at the week's news headlines. See you next time.
Demands to topple the government. Thousands of Lebanese make their voices heard in downtown Beirut. These demonstrations were triggered after rubbish began piling up on the streets of the capital following the closure of the main landfill. Young people formed a movement called You Stink.
The grassroots nature of this movement is what so many people here believe give it so much power.
The share sell-off began within minutes of the Shanghai Stock Exchange opening. At one point, the index fell by 9%, recovering only slightly. Some of China's biggest companies, which means some of the world's biggest, are listed here.
The government is reassuring investors, but everything it's so far tried to rescue the market has failed.
Here we have what's called a one-stop centre, which is yet another transit point in this journey for tens of thousands of people. In fact, 10,000 people have passed through this centre in the past 5 days alone.
South Sudan's president has signed a peace deal aimed at ending nearly 2 years of violence in the country. Salva Kiir signed the agreement in the presence of regional leaders in the capital, Juba, but he's expressed reservations over whether it'll end his country's civil war.
Demonstrators are calling for the resignation of President Juan Orlando Hernandez. They've been gathering each week for more than 3 months since the government was linked to a multi-million-dollar fraud at the welfare department. Many want a UN investigation.